Imagine, just for a second, that you are standing on your front porch. It is 12:55 in the afternoon, September 29th, 1927. You are in St. Louis. The air is thick, heavy, like a wet wool blanket draped over your face. It has been raining all morning. A cold, miserable, gray, drenching rain. But now, the rain stops. Suddenly, the clouds break apart. A beam of sunlight actually cuts through the gloom. It hits the wet pavement of the street, making the cobblestones shine like diamonds. You take a deep breath, you step out. You unlock the front door, and you walk onto the porch to check the mail. You think the storm is over. You think the danger is past. You think about lunch, about work, about the math test you have tomorrow. You are wrong, dead wrong, because 3 miles away, hidden behind a curtain of steam and fog and smoke, something is coming for you. You cannot see it. You cannot hear it yet. But it is already on the ground. It is already moving at 60 miles per hour. It is eating the earth. In 5 minutes, just 300 seconds from this moment, the sun will be gone. The street you are standing on will be gone. And 79 people will be dead. This isn't a movie. This isn't a prediction. This is the story of the 1927 St. Louis tornado. We often think of tornadoes as these visible, high-contrast monsters on the horizon. We have seen the videos from storm chasers in Oklahoma. We know what they look like, the dark funnel, the swirling debris. We think, if one comes, we will see it. We will have time to run. We will have time to hide. But St. Louis didn't. This monster was different. This monster was invisible. It wrapped itself in rain. It cloaked itself in the steam rising from the hot city streets. It didn't look like a tornado. It looked like a low, bruised cloud dragging across the rooftops. By the time people realized what that cloud actually was, the roof was already peeling off their house. If this storm happened today, right now, on the exact same path, meteorologists estimate the damage bill would exceed $3 billion. It would be one of the most expensive weather disasters in American history. It carved a scar, 6 miles long, right through the heart of one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It turned brick mansions into gravel. It turned schools into tombs. And it did it all, in less time than it takes to boil an egg. But the most terrifying part of this story isn't the wind speed. It isn't the barometric pressure. It isn't even the death toll. The most terrifying part is the silence, the fatal optimism, the belief that because the sun came out, everything was going to be okay. So, how does a metropolis die in 300 seconds? How does a city of industry, of steel and brick and iron, simply shatter? To understand that, we have to go back, before the screams, before the sirens, before the silence. We have to go back to the morning when St. Louis felt invincible, 1927. You have to understand what that year meant. It wasn't just a date on a calendar. It was a vibe. It was an energy. It was the peak, the absolute zenith of the Roaring Twenties. The stock market was rocketing toward the moon. Jazz was spilling out of every doorway in the city. And St. Louis was the crown jewel of the Midwest. This was the 4th largest city in the United States. Bigger than Los Angeles, bigger than Detroit. It was the gateway to the West, the engine room of America. If you walked down Washington Avenue in 1927, you would smell money. You would smell coal smoke and expensive perfume and roasting coffee. This was a city of brick. That is important. Remember that. Brick. St. Louis sat on massive deposits of red clay, so they built everything out of it. They didn't build flimsy wooden houses like they did on the plains. They built fortresses. They built row houses with walls 3 layers thick. They built factories that looked like castles. They built churches with steeples that scratched the sky. The people here felt safe. They felt permanent. When you live in a house made of solid, fired red brick, you don't worry about the wind. You worry about the mortgage, maybe. You worry about prohibition. You worry about the Cardinals game. But you don't worry about your house falling down. That year, the city was drunk on its own success. Just 4 months earlier, a young pilot named Charles Lindbergh had flown across the Atlantic Ocean. And what was the name painted on the side of his plane? The Spirit of St. Louis. The whole world knew the name of this city. It was famous. It was modern. It was unstoppable. It was a Tuesday, September 29th. The city woke up to the sound of streetcars, the clang, clang, clang of iron wheels on iron tracks. There were hundreds of miles of streetcar tracks weaving through the city like a nervous system. Men in fedoras and sharp wool suits packed onto the trams, heading downtown to the skyscrapers. Women in flapper dresses and cloche hats were heading to the department stores. The factories were humming. The breweries were officially making soft drinks because of prohibition. But we all know the underground taps were flowing. It was a city at work, a machine running at full efficiency. But there was a flaw in the design, not in the buildings, but in the geography. St. Louis sits at a very specific, very dangerous intersection. It is where the mighty Mississippi River meets the Missouri River. It is a flat, humid basin, and on this particular Tuesday, the geography that made St. Louis rich was brewing its destruction. While the bankers were checking the ticker tape and the students at Central High School were opening their textbooks, the atmosphere above their heads was preparing to declare war. You see, weather doesn't care about your stock portfolio. It doesn't care about your brick walls. It understands only one thing: balance. Nature hates an imbalance. And on the morning of September 29th, the atmosphere over St. Louis was critically, violently unbalanced. Before we look at the map, before we see the red lines crossing over the city, I want to ask you a favor. We are about to reconstruct a disaster that has been largely forgotten by history. Most people know about the Titanic. Most people know about the San Francisco earthquake. But the St. Louis tornado has slipped through the cracks. We are digging into the archives, pulling up the survivor testimonies, and using modern meteorology to explain exactly what happened that day. Okay? Let's look at the sky. To understand the violence of what happened, we have to stop thinking like historians and start thinking like physicists. A tornado is not magic. It is an energy transfer. It is the atmosphere trying to fix a temperature problem as quickly and as violently as possible. On the morning of September 29th, two massive, invisible armies were marching towards St. Louis. From the south, coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, was a mass of warm, moist air. It was heavy with water. It was energetic. It was unstable. Think of it as fuel, gasoline vapor, just waiting for a spark. From the west, rolling down off the Rocky Mountains, came the trigger, a sharp, cold, dry front. Normally, these two fronts might mix gradually. They might create some rain, maybe a thunderstorm. But on this day, they didn't mix. They collided. They slammed into each other right over the city of St. Louis. When that cold air hit the warm air, it acted like a wedge. It drove underneath the warm air, forcing it upward, rapidly. Updrafts began to rocket into the sky. We are talking about millions of tons of air, shooting straight up at speeds that would rival a modern elevator. As this air rose, it started to cool. The moisture in it condensed. Clouds exploded upward, towering 40, 50, 60,000 feet into the atmosphere. These weren't just rain clouds. These were supercells. But there was one more ingredient needed to turn a thunderstorm into a city killer: wind shear. At the surface, the wind was blowing from the southeast, but 5,000 feet up, the wind was blowing from the southwest, and it was blowing much, much faster. This change in wind direction and speed created a rolling motion. Imagine a rolling pin spinning horizontally in the air. Now, take that updraft we talked about, that elevator of rising air, and tilt that rolling pin vertical. Suddenly, the storm is rotating. It is now a mesocyclone, a giant, spinning engine of destruction, and it was sitting right over the west end of St. Louis. There is a photograph, taken days after the storm. that perfectly captures the physics of this event. It is a picture of a telephone pole, a solid, wooden telephone pole. Sticking out of the side of the pole, driven deep into the wood grain, is a single piece of straw, wheat straw. Think about that for a second. A flimsy piece of dry grass, drove into a telephone pole like a nail. How is that possible? It comes down to velocity. When the wind speeds cross a certain threshold, the laws of physics that we interact with daily, they start to break down. Soft objects become projectiles. Hard objects become liquid. At 200 miles per hour, a piece of straw has enough kinetic energy to pierce wood before the wood has time to splinter. The people of St. Louis didn't know about wind shear. They didn't have Doppler radar. They didn't have satellites. They only had the morning paper, and the morning paper lied to them. 700 hours, 7 a.m. The sun rises over the Mississippi River. The editors at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat and the Post-Dispatch are finalizing the morning edition. Families are sitting down to breakfast. Fathers are snapping open the newspaper to check the weather. Let's read what they saw. This is the actual text from the weather report for September 29th, 1927. Quote, "Rains and squalls, unsettled conditions." End quote. That was it. Rains and squalls. There was no bold text, no red warning banners, no siren emojis. Just a polite suggestion that you might want to bring an umbrella. You have to remember, the word tornado was actually banned from weather forecasts for decades in the United States. The government thought using the word would cause panic. They thought panic was more dangerous than the wind, so they used code words. Severe local storms, shifting winds. But nobody in St. Louis read rains and squalls and thought, I need to reinforce the basement. They thought, I hope the streetcar isn't wet. But while the newspaper was predicting rain, the instruments were telling a different story, a much darker story. In the arcade building downtown, there was a barometer. A barometer measures the weight of the air pressing down on the earth. In a high-pressure system, sunny weather, the air is heavy. It pushes the mercury up. In a low-pressure system, stormy weather, the air lifts. The mercury drops. At 10:30 in the morning, the mercury in the arcade building didn't just drop. It dove. It began a steep, terrifying decline. The air pressure over St. Louis was plummeting. The atmosphere was literally lifting off the ground, creating a vacuum. If you have ever been near a tornado, survivors often talk about their ears popping, like being on an airplane that is descending too fast. That sensation started happening across the city around noon. People felt off. Workers in the factories rubbed their temples. Children in school shook their heads, trying to clear the pressure in their ears. The air felt electric, static. Have you ever felt that, when the hair on your arm stands up, and you don't know why? It's the atmosphere charging up. But life went on. The clocks ticked, 11 a.m., the rain gets harder, 12 p.m., lunchtime. The restaurants in the Dogtown neighborhood are packing up. People are ordering sandwiches, complaining about the mud. The storm is building. The energy is coiling tighter and tighter. And then, we reach the most dangerous moment of the entire day. The moment that killed the most people. The moment of the lie. 12:50 p.m., 10 minutes to 1, the rain, which had been hammering the roofs all morning, tapers off. Drip, drip, drip. Silence. The clouds, which had been a solid sheet of gray granite, begin to tear open. And there it is. The sun. It wasn't a weak sun. It was bright, warm. It flooded the wet streets with light. Psychologically, this was the trigger for disaster. In disaster psychology, there is a concept called normalcy bias. It is the brain's refusal to believe that a disaster will happen to you. We are wired to look for signs that everything is okay. We want to believe the danger has passed. So, when the rain stopped, St. Louis exhaled. In the West End, housewives walked out to their backyards to hang laundry that had been sitting in baskets. Shopkeepers rolled up their awnings. Children ran out into the playgrounds of their schools. At Central High School, the lunch bell was ringing. Students were flooding the hallways, laughing, shouting, swapping stories. Some of them went to the gymnasium, the girls' gymnasium. It was a massive brick structure, solid, safe, a place to play volleyball, a place to gossip. They had no idea that the physics of that roof were about to fail them. But there was one man who didn't trust the sun. We don't know his name, but his testimony survives in the archives. He was a delivery driver. He was sitting in his truck near Manchester Avenue. He looked up at the sky. Most people saw blue, but he looked to the southwest, toward the edge of the city. He saw a cloud. But it wasn't gray, and it wasn't white. It was green, a deep, bruised, sickly olive green. Green clouds mean one thing: hail, massive amounts of ice suspended in the air, reflecting the sunlight in a way that shouldn't exist. He watched the green cloud. It seemed to be boiling, not moving with the wind, but boiling inside itself, churning. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He realized, suddenly, that the street was too quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The stray dogs had vanished. The city was holding its breath. He reached for the door handle of his truck. He wanted to run, but it was too late. 12:58 p.m., 2 minutes left. The barometer at St. Louis University bottoms out. It is now reading 29.0, a historic low. The vacuum is complete. The green cloud lowers. It touches the ground near the corner of Manchester and Sulphur Avenues. There is no funnel yet, not a clean one. It is a ragged, messy wall of wind. Because it has been raining all morning, the ground is saturated. As soon as the wind hits the earth, it rips up water, mud, and steam. This creates a cloak, a shroud of white mist that wraps around the tornado. To the people standing a few blocks away, it doesn't look like a tornado. It looks like a fog bank, a strange, fast-moving fog rolling down the street. Inside that fog, the wind speeds are already passing 150 miles per hour. It hits its first house. It doesn't blow the house over. The pressure difference is so extreme that the house simply explodes. The walls blow outward. The roof collapses inward. Then the next house, and the next. It is moving northeast, straight toward Forest Park, straight toward the high school, 1 o'clock. The church bells in the city begin to chime the hour, bong, 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 but nobody hears them, because suddenly the sound arrives. Survivors would later describe it in different ways. Some said it sounded like a million bees buzzing at once. Some said it sounded like a waterfall. But the most common description, the one that appears in diary after diary, is the train. Imagine a freight train, a heavy steel locomotive. Now imagine it is off the tracks. Imagine it is driving down your street, scraping against the pavement, grinding metal on stone. Now multiply that sound by 1,000. At 1:01 p.m., the sun vanished. The light that had tricked everyone just 10 minutes ago was snuffed out. The sky turned black. Midnight black. In the darkness, the wind began to scream. The delivery driver we mentioned earlier, he watched as a streetcar, a 20-ton iron vehicle, was lifted off the tracks. It didn't roll over, it floated. It hovered in the air for a second, defying gravity, and then it was thrown through the front window of a department store. The monster was here. It was in the city, and it was hungry. Central High School was directly in its path. Inside, the teachers heard the roar. They looked at the windows. The glass began to bow inward. The time for preparation was over. The time for survival had begun. 1:02 p.m. It is happening. The monster has crossed the threshold. It is no longer a threat. It is a reality. It tears into the west end of the city, and the first thing it meets is Forest Park. Now. You have to understand the scale of Forest Park. This isn't a playground. It is massive. It is bigger than Central Park in New York City. It is filled with ancient, giant oak trees. Trees that have stood for 100 years. Trees with roots as thick as your leg. When the tornado hits the park, it doesn't just break the trees. It liquefies them. Witnesses said it looked like a lawnmower going through tall grass. Snap, snap, snap. Thousands of trees, instantly decapitated. The sound is deafening. It is a physical weight pressing against your chest. The air pressure is dropping so fast that people's ears are popping violently. It feels like your head is underwater. Debris is now flying through the air at 200 miles per hour. But it isn't just branches and leaves. It is pieces of roofs. It is chimney bricks. It is iron fences. And it is birds. Thousands of birds that were roosting in the park are sucked into the vortex. They are stripped of their feathers instantly by the wind speed. The tornado is now 600 yards wide. That is 6 football fields. A solid, grinding, black wall of debris. It is moving northeast. It is hungry. And it is heading straight for the residential district. Imagine you are in your house. You are hiding under the dining room table. You are holding your children. The floor starts to shake, not vibrate, shake like an earthquake. The china in the cabinet rattles, then shatters. The light bulbs in the ceiling explode. Pop, pop, pop. Darkness. Then the windows go. Crash. Glass sprays across the room like shrapnel. The wind invades your home. It feels hot. That is the strange thing survivors remember. The wind wasn't cold. It was hot. It smelled like sulfur, and wet plaster, and pulverized brick. You scream, but you can't hear yourself. The roar is too loud. It consumes everything. And then the house groans. The nails holding the wood frame together start to pull out. The bricks start to separate from the mortar. In the span of 4 seconds, the roof over your head is simply lifted. Gone. You look up, and instead of your ceiling, you see the spinning black chaos of the funnel. This was the reality for thousands of people in the West End at 1:03 p.m. But the storm wasn't done. It was just warming up. It was gathering strength. It was feeding on the debris. Every house it destroyed became ammunition to destroy the next one. And directly in its path, sitting exposed and vulnerable, was the most tragic target of all. Central High School. 1:05 p.m. Central High School. Inside. There are hundreds of students. The bell had rung. Lunch was ending. In the girls' gymnasium, a physical education class is in session. We need to talk about the architecture of this gym. It is important. It is a large, brick building with a high, vaulted roof. The roof is heavy. Slate tiles, massive wooden trusses. The girls are wearing their gym uniforms. Bloomers and white midi blouses. They are laughing. They are young. They have their whole lives ahead of them. The teacher, a woman named Miss O'Leary, hears the roar. She knows. Instinct takes over. She screams, "Get down! Get away from the walls!" She doesn't wait for them to understand. She starts grabbing students, shoving them under benches, pushing them flat onto the floor. "Cover your heads!" The roar hits the building like a physical blow. Bam! The brick walls of the school are 3 feet thick. They should be safe. They should be safe. But the tornado hits the building at a specific angle. It creates a vacuum effect on the leeward side of the gym. The air inside the gym is at normal pressure. The air outside is at a catastrophic low pressure. The building tries to breathe. The walls push outward. The windows explode outward. And then the support for the massive roof vanishes. It happens in slow motion in the minds of the survivors. But in reality, it took less than a second. The roof, tons of slate and timber, detaches. It hovers for a split second, and then gravity takes over. It falls. Straight down. Crash. It creates a sandwich of death. The roof slams onto the floor, crushing everything underneath it. The screaming stops. Instantly. Replaced by the sound of settling dust, and the wind howling through the hole where the ceiling used to be. Miss O'Leary, the teacher, she was shielded by a sturdy wooden bench. She crawls out. She is covered in white dust. She is bleeding. She looks around. The gym is gone. It is a pile of rubble. She calls out names. Mary, Helen, Margaret. Silence. Then a moan. Then a cry for help. Some of the girls had made it to the stairwell. The stairwell held. They are huddled together. sobbing, shaking, terrified. But others were not so lucky. We won't describe the gore. We don't need to. The horror is in the absence, the empty desks, the shoes left on the floor. In that one room, in that 1 second, 5 students were killed instantly. Many more were trapped, buried alive under tons of brick and slate. The principal, hearing the crash, runs toward the gym. He finds a wall of rubble. He starts digging with his bare hands. He tears his fingernails off. He doesn't care. He is digging, digging, digging. Hold on! We're coming! But the storm doesn't pause to mourn. It doesn't stop to look at what it did. It keeps moving, 60 miles per hour. Next stop, the river. There was a myth in St. Louis, a legend. Old-timers used to sit on their porches and say, "We are safe here. Tornadoes can't cross the Mississippi River. The water breaks them up. The air changes." It was a comforting lie. It made people feel safe. At 1:08 p.m., the tornado proved them wrong. It reached the banks of the Mississippi, the great, muddy, mile-wide river. If the river was supposed to be a shield, it failed. The tornado hit the water, and it turned into a monster of a different kind. It became a waterspout, a massive, churning column of water and mud. It sucked the river up into the sky. Imagine a blender the size of a skyscraper, mixing air and water and debris. The Eads Bridge, the historic steel bridge connecting St. Louis to Illinois. A marvel of engineering. The tornado slammed into it. The steel groaned. The massive iron trusses twisted. But the bridge held. Barely. But on the river itself, there were boats, small fishing boats, tugboats, barges. They didn't stand a chance. The wind picked them up, not pushed them. Picked them up, thrown against the piers of the bridge, capsized, sunk. The myth of the river was dead. The tornado crossed into Illinois in less than 60 seconds. It hit Venice. It hit Granite City. It was weaker now, but only slightly. It tore through the industrial yards. It ripped the roofs off factories. It scattered coal piles like black confetti. And then something strange happened. The randomness. We have to talk about the randomness, because that is what drives survivors crazy. That is what keeps them awake at night for 50 years. Why did my house fall and the neighbor's house stand? There is a story of a house on Lindell Boulevard, a mansion. The entire second floor was sheared off, clean, like a knife cut it. But on the first floor, on the dining room table, a vase of flowers was still standing. The water hadn't even spilled. How? How does a force strong enough to rip apart brick leave a flower petal undisturbed? It is the chaos of the vortex, the suction spots, the microbursts. It is a game of Russian roulette played by the atmosphere. Click, safe, click, safe, click, dead. One man was taking a bath when the roof flew off. He was left sitting in the tub, open to the sky, completely unharmed, watching the clouds spin above him. Another man, standing 3 feet away, was hit by a flying brick and killed instantly. It makes no sense. It defies logic. And that is the horror of it. You can't plan for it. You can't outsmart it. You just have to be lucky. And at 1:10 p.m., luck was the only currency that mattered in St. Louis. The storm is now in Illinois. It is starting to lose its structure. The cold front is overtaking the warm front. The energy is dissipating. The engine is running out of fuel. But back in St. Louis, the event is still happening. Because the wind is only half the problem. The other half is the collapse. Buildings that were damaged are now giving up. Walls that were cracked are now falling. Fires are starting. Gas lines were severed when the houses were ripped from their foundations. Now, the gas is leaking. It is filling the pockets of rubble. A spark from a downed power line. Whoosh! Fire. In the pouring rain. In the middle of a tornado aftermath. Fires begin to burn. Imagine the smell. The sharp, acrid smell of burning wood, mixed with the wet. Earthy smell of the storm. People trapped in the rubble smell the smoke. Panic. Absolute, primal panic. They are pinned. They can't move. And they smell fire. Help! Fire! Help us! Neighbors who survived crawl out of their basements. They see the smoke. They ignore their own injuries. They run toward the piles of brick. This is where the heroes are made. Not the police, not the fire department. They can't get through. The streets are blocked by thousands of fallen trees and telephone poles. The first responders are the housewives, the shopkeepers, the teenagers. They form bucket lines. They use car jacks to lift concrete slabs. At Central High School, the teachers are the first responders. They are pulling bricks off their students. Their hands are bleeding. They are crying. But they don't stop. One teacher finds a girl. She is trapped by her legs. She is conscious. She is terrified. "It's okay," the teacher says. "It's okay. I've got you." She doesn't know if it's okay. She doesn't know if the rest of the building is going to fall on them. But she lies. She lies to give the child hope. "Look at me," she says. "Just look at me." Outside, the rain is still falling, but the wind has died down. The roar is fading. The freight train is driving away. It is moving east into the cornfields of Illinois, where it will finally, eventually, lift back into the clouds. But in the city, the clock is ticking. 1:12 p.m., 1:13 p.m. The adrenaline is still pumping. People are running on pure shock. They don't feel their broken arms. They don't feel the glass in their feet. They just move, lift, pull, carry, lift, pull, carry. It is a scene of medieval warfare. Bodies lying on the wet grass of Forest Park. People wandering the streets, dazed, covered in mud, asking for family members who are already dead. A woman walks down the street holding a teapot. Just a teapot. It is the only thing she has left. She is clutching it like it is the most precious diamond in the world. She walks past a car that has been crushed flat like a pancake. She walks past a tram car that is upside down. She doesn't see them. She is in shock. "Have you seen my husband?" she asks the air. "Have you seen my husband?" No answer. Only the sound of sirens starting to wail in the distance. Miles away. 1:15 p.m. It is over. 5 minutes. That's it. 5 minutes ago. You were checking the mail. 5 minutes ago. The girls were playing volleyball. 5 minutes ago. The streetcar was on the tracks. Now, nothing is the same. The tornado has lifted. The sky, believe it or not, begins to clear almost immediately. The sun comes back out. It shines down on the destruction with a cruel, bright indifference. And then, the sound hits you. Not the roar. The roar is gone. It is the silence. For a few seconds, there is no sound at all. No birds, no traffic, no wind. Just a heavy, ringing, dead silence. It is the silence of a city that has been punched in the gut. Then, slowly, the sounds of life return. But they aren't the sounds of the city. A car alarm honking in the distance. The hiss of a broken steam pipe. The drip, drip, drip of water falling from ruined ceilings. And then, the screams. At first, just one, then another, then a chorus. "Mama! Help! Over here!" The city wakes up from its nightmare and realizes the nightmare is real. The telephone lines are dead. You can't call the police. You can't call your mom. The power is out. The traffic lights are dark. You are alone. For the next hour. Until the National Guard arrives. St. Louis is on its own. There is no government. There is no authority. There is only the rubble, the rain, and the people standing next to you. The great silence has begun. But in the distance, the barometer begins to stabilize. The pressure rises. The atmosphere has fixed its imbalance. Nature is satisfied. The cost was 79 lives, 550 injuries, $2 billion in damage. But the air is balanced again. The sun shines on the broken brick and the survivors, the ones who crawled out of the holes, the ones who stood up in the ruins. They look at each other. They are covered in gray dust. They look like ghosts. They don't speak. They don't have to. They know that the world they lived in at 1255 is gone. It was deleted. And now, they have to figure out how to live in the new one. Everything we just described, the trees snapping, the roof falling, the bridge twisting, it all happened in the time it takes to listen to 2 songs on the radio. 300 seconds. We are standing in the wreckage now. The dust is settling, the adrenaline is starting to fade, and the pain is setting in. But the story isn't over. In fact, the hardest part is just beginning. Because now comes the night. Now come the looters. Now comes the martial law. And now comes the question, why? Why did the school fall? Why did the forecast fail? And could it happen again? We need to analyze the aftermath. We need to look at the investigation that changed building codes forever. But first, we need to take a breath. Look around the ruins. The silence is deafening. 1:30 p.m. The storm is gone. The sun is out. But the city is bleeding. In modern emergency medicine, there is a concept called the golden hour. It is the first 60 minutes after a trauma. If you can get a patient to a hospital within that hour, their chances of survival skyrocket. In 1927, St. Louis didn't have a golden hour. It had a golden nightmare. Remember, there is no 911. You cannot dial 3 digits and summon a helicopter. The telephone poles are snapped like toothpicks. The lines are tangled in the wet streets, live wires sizzling in the puddles. So, communication is dead. The hospitals, Barnes Hospital, St. John's, they know something bad has happened because the sky turned black. But they don't know the scale. They don't know that thousands of people are currently bleeding out in the West End. So, the citizens have to improvise. This is where the story shifts from a disaster movie to a war movie. The streets are impassable. You can't drive an ambulance over a fallen oak tree. You can't drive a fire truck through a house that is sitting in the middle of the road. So, they used what they had. Delivery trucks, furniture vans, even coal wagons. Survivors were piled into the back of bakery trucks, bleeding, covered in dust, lying on top of each other. The injuries were specific, and they were gruesome. In a tornado, the biggest danger isn't the wind, it's the debris, it's the glass. Doctors reported that almost every victim had scalp wounds. The air was filled with so much flying glass and slate that it acted like a sandblaster. People had shards of glass embedded in their skin, in their hair, in their clothes, fractures, crushed limbs, internal bleeding from the pressure changes. The triage centers weren't sterile rooms. They were front lawns. They were hotel lobbies. At the Coronado Hotel, which had its windows blown out, the lobby was turned into a field hospital. Guests tore up the bedsheets to make bandages. Waiters became nurses. The rich and the poor were bleeding on the same expensive carpets. The storm didn't care about your bank account. And amidst this chaos, the rumors started. Information in a vacuum is dangerous. The whole city is gone. The river is flooding. Another storm is coming. Panic is contagious. People started running. Not away from the damage, but just running. Trying to find their children at school. Trying to get home. But home wasn't there anymore. At Central High School, the situation was desperate. The fire department finally arrived on foot. They brought axes and crowbars. They worked side by side with the fathers of the trapped girls. Imagine that. A father digging through the bricks of his daughter's school, praying he doesn't find her, and praying he does. Every time they found a body, a hush would fall over the crowd. They would lift the sheet. A parent would step forward, a scream, a sob, and then back to digging. There was no time for grief, not yet, because the sun was going down. And in 1927, when the sun went down, the city went dark, true dark. Sunset, 6 p.m. The electric grid is shattered. The streetlights are dead. The only light comes from the moon and the fires that are still smoldering in the ruins. This is when the second wave of horror begins. Looting. It is an ugly truth of disaster. When authority collapses, wolves come out. Within hours of the storm, men were seen walking through the destroyed mansions of the West End. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for silverware, jewelry, safes that had been blown open. It is sickening, but it is human nature. The police commissioner realized he had lost control. The local cops were overwhelmed. They were exhausted. Some of them had lost their own homes. So, they made a call. Martial law. The call went out to the National Guard. By midnight, Trucks filled with soldiers were rolling into St. Louis. Bayonets fixed, live ammunition. The orders were clear. Shoot to kill. If you see a looter, do not arrest him. Do not read him his rights. Shoot him. The city was divided into zones. Checkpoints were set up on the streets. You had to have a pass to enter the damage zone. Even residents couldn't get back to their own houses without permission. Imagine the atmosphere. Pitch black darkness. Rain starting to fall again. The smell of wet ash. And on every corner, a soldier with a rifle, silhouetted against the moonlight. St. Louis had become a war zone. But in the darkness, there were moments of grace. The Red Cross arrived. They set up tents in the parks. They brought hot coffee. They brought blankets. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other, people who lived next door for 10 years but never said hello, were now sleeping under the same tarp. They shared food. They shared stories. I was in the kitchen, one would say. I was in the bath, said another. I lost my dog. I lost my house. This shared trauma created a bond, a scar tissue that connected the community. But as the sun rose on Friday morning, the shock began to wear off, and the questions began. The anger began. Why did the school collapse? Why didn't we know? Why us? The investigation that followed the 1927 tornado was one of the first modern disaster autopsies in American history. Engineers and architects descended on the city. They didn't just want to clean up. They wanted to learn. They walked through the ruins of Central High School. They looked at the bricks. They looked at the mortar. And they found something disturbing. It wasn't that the building was poorly built. It was built like a fortress. But it was built for the wrong kind of war. It was built to withstand gravity. It was built to hold heavy loads down, but a tornado doesn't push down. It pulls up. The roof of the gym wasn't anchored to the walls to prevent uplift. It was just resting there, heavy and secure against gravity, but defenseless against suction. When the pressure dropped, the roof didn't just fall, it was lifted, then dropped. This discovery changed architecture. Engineers realized that we needed to bolt roofs to walls. We needed steel straps. We needed to design buildings that could hold together even when the atmosphere was trying to pull them apart. If you go into your attic today and you look at where the rafters meet the wall, you might see a metal clip, a hurricane tie. That clip exists, in part, because of what happened in St. Louis. But there was another failure, a failure of information. The Weather Bureau took a hard look at their forecast. Rains and squalls. They realized that their fear of the word tornado had cost lives. They realized that people needed to know the truth, even if it was scary. It would take decades for the policy to fully change. It wasn't until the late 1940s that tornado warnings became standard. But the conversation started here, in the rubble of the West End. Okay, so we have the engineering failure, we have the forecast failure. But there is one more thing. The ghost. The ghost of 1896. You see, this wasn't the first time St. Louis had been hit. 30 years earlier, in 1896, a massive tornado killed over 250 people in this same city. The people of 1927 knew that story. Their parents had lived through it, but they thought it was a fluke, a once-in-a-lifetime event. Lightning doesn't strike twice, they said. Well, tornadoes do. The 1927 storm followed a path that was terrifyingly similar to the earlier storm. It was like the atmosphere had a favorite target. This realization shattered the city's confidence. St. Louis wasn't just unlucky. It was vulnerable. The geography that made it a trade hub, the Flat River Basin, also made it a bowling alley for supercells. This psychological blow was heavy. People moved away, businesses relocated, the city rebuilt. Yes. The bricks were stacked again, the roofs were repaired, but the swagger of the Roaring Twenties was gone. The fatal optimism was dead. So, why don't we talk about this? Why is the St. Louis tornado of 1927 not as famous as the San Francisco earthquake or the Chicago fire? Maybe it's because it happened in the Midwest. Maybe it's because it happened quickly. Or maybe it's because it was overshadowed. 2 years later, in 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. The economic storm wiped out the memory of the windstorm. The pain of the tornado was buried under the pain of poverty, but the scar remains. If you walk through St. Louis today, through the central West End, pay attention, look at the houses. You will see a row of Victorian mansions, ornate, beautiful, old, and then, suddenly, a gap, or a house that looks different, newer. Maybe a 1930s brick bungalow sitting between two 1890s castles. That is the scar. That is where the monster stepped. That newer house is a gravestone. It marks the spot where a family lost everything in 300 seconds. The trees in Forest Park are younger than they should be. The original giants are gone, the city healed, but the tissue is different. And the threat hasn't gone anywhere. Today, St. Louis is bigger. The population has spread out. The suburbs stretch for miles. We have Doppler radar now. We have sirens. We have cell phone alerts that scream at us before the sky turns green. We are safer. Much safer. But we are not invincible. Meteorologists have run the numbers. If a tornado of the same size and intensity hit St. Louis today, the results would be catastrophic, because there is more stuff to destroy. More glass skyscrapers, more cars, more people. The damage estimate? $3 to $6 billion. And despite all our technology, we still have the same problem they had in 1927. Normalcy bias. When your phone buzzes with a tornado warning, what do? Do you run to the basement immediately? Or do you look out the window? Do you check Twitter? Do you wait? That hesitation, that fatal optimism, is human nature. It hasn't changed in 100 years. We still want to believe the sun will stay out. We still want to believe the storm will miss us. September 29th, 1927. It started as a rainy Tuesday. It ended as a graveyard. In 5 minutes, a force of nature reminded a powerful city that it was just a guest on this earth. We build our walls of brick. We build our towers of steel. We draw our maps and we pave our roads. We tell ourselves that we are in control. But every once in a while, the sky turns green, the pressure drops, and the atmosphere decides to rewrite the map. The people of St. Louis rebuilt their city. They buried their dead. They went back to work. They showed us that while we cannot control the wind, we can control how we respond to it. We can choose to help our neighbors. We can choose to rebuild. But let this story be a whisper in your ear the next time the clouds gather, when the barometer drops, and the birds stop singing, and the air feels heavy. Don't wait for the sun. Don't trust the silence. Because the monster doesn't care if you see it coming. It only cares about one thing: balance.